all I was paying attention to was the subject in front of me, usually a bird, and it was just all about photograph that bird, photograph that bird.
And the goal was to shoot it so that the head, the eye, the bill are all sharp, which this one is, and then I just wanted it to melt away after that.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to another wildlife-inspired talk. It's Ray Hennessy here with Scott Keys, as always. Tonight,
Hello.
We are going to be talking about how to maximize your post-production for wildlife photography. So it's going to be a little bit of a mix of, easy edits of a photo that maybe doesn't look so great, and we can kind of show you the potential that might be there. So, you don't always have to delete the photos that don't start out great. And then we're also going to dive into photos that really need some help, and you can really kind of make them shine with some good post-production techniques. So a couple different topics, and then we're also going to be showing, we're going to do an edit of some user-submitted photos, which is going to be really great. And then make sure you stay till the end if you can. We're going to do an edit off, which we've done once before. So Scott and I are going to have a 5-minute time limit. It's another user-submitted photo. We're going to both edit it at the same time, and then we'll kind of see where we end up at the end. So that should be a lot of fun. So I'm going to hand it over to Scott, and we're going to get started.
Yeah, and up on the screen right now, I've got a picture of a black-billed cuckoo, and I wanted to talk about this kind of to kick off the editing, and just to show you that there's a lot of different ways to go with editing. So because I do a lot of portraits of birds, just real curious, and you can put this in the comments, how natural does this look to you? Not a heavily edited image. If you think it's a heavy edit, you can let me know in the comments right now. If you think it kind of looks clean and nice, put it in there. I'm going to show you what it looks like. This is the after, and I'm just going to pop over and show you the before. Ray and I are going to take some time to go through about 5-10 images each, show you some before and afters, and in a couple of them, we'll actually go through the process of how we edit it. I'm going to show you this one before I start an actual live edit of a user submitted. So this is the first, this is the post. So this is what I did with this image, and here's what it looked like before I did anything. And I was really excited to get this picture because I had the bird that I wanted, and he was in a pretty isolated area. But you can see from the raw file that he was in shade, and it really didn't show his eye very well. All I did with this is push a little bit of the whites and the blacks to get some contrast. But primarily, you'll see this top area right here is now lightened, and then I burned down around the back. So that really not a whole lot was done, but I think when you toggle back and forth here, you're going to see why editing is so critical in some photos. Before I get into the live edit, I do want to just talk about this whole concept of editing. I can remember several conversations with people where we would be talking and they would say something like, well, I like my images to look just like they came out of the camera.
Yeah, I hear it all the time
I don't
as well.
I don't like to edit any of my images. So a few things, and Ray, you can jump in and correct me if I'm wrong on any of this, but a couple things that I want everybody to consider. One is I edit 100% of every picture I ever take.
Same here.
And there's a lot of reasons. Yeah, there's a lot of reasons for that. And any photographer is going to retouch something. When you take a picture, especially with a raw file, you're never capturing what your eye truly sees. I can remember my mother-in-law was talking to me one day, and she said, well, why do you edit that? I don't want an edited picture of yours. I want the real picture. And so I took my camera and I told her to look at the woods where there was shadow and light and color. And I said, I really want you to study that. And I took a picture of it. And then I showed her the picture at 35 millimeters to try to approximate what she might see. And I said, now look at all the details and look at the shadows that you can't see anymore. And look at these bright spots. The camera can't capture the dynamic range that your eye has or your brain has. So that's where editing comes into play. In a lot of cases, we're trying to replicate what we see or maybe trying to enhance to make it a little bit more visually appealing. Even camera body to camera body. So if somebody's shooting a Nikon versus a Canon, you may see two different images in the raw files. So for that reason, every image can be touched and you shouldn't feel guilty about it. You shouldn't feel like you're cheating. I'm going to do a live edit real quick on a portrait But I did want to talk about that real quick. And Ray, did you have anything you wanted to add to that while I'm pulling up this picture?
No, I think that's exactly the point I would want to make. That these cameras just really cannot see what our eye can see. So the edit process for me is always to try and bring it pretty close to what my eye saw that day. And there are definitely times where it's a more artistic photo, or I may push it further than what my eye saw. And that's just my perspective and my desire to do so. And I can completely respect the people that wouldn't want to do that. But I think most of the time I'm just trying to get it back to close to what my eye saw. And, I think as cameras get better and better, it's going to get closer and closer to these cameras seeing what our eye can see, and I would assume at some point probably even better than what our eye can see. But for now, it's still not quite there yet. So yeah.
Yeah. So I'm going to do a picture real quick. This is was submitted by Julian, I think Gottfried.
Yeah.
I want to say he's from the UK, but I could be wrong on that. Now, he's a young photographer. He's actually really talented. I like watching his stuff. What I'm going to do with this one, I'm going to do a technique that I do sometimes, which is to edit two versions of the same image. I'm going to do this pretty quickly. But just try to follow along with the concepts. This one had a little bit of noise. You can see it's a darker exposure, and it's at ISO 1600. And this was shot with a Nikon D500.
Nice.
And I can tell you right now, the noise on that isn't going to be acceptable when it's viewed close. Now, this is uncropped right now, and I'm not even going to do anything with the crop of this.
Bit of a
I'm going
tight
to leave
portrait.
it as is. Yeah, it's real tight. And if I had more time, I would actually add canvas to the top. But for this, I'm just going to show you a way that I deal with an image with a lot of noise. And this is the noise reduction slider, and I'm using Adobe Camera Raw, but you can do this in Photoshop. And I'm just going to dial this up, and as I go up, I'm reducing noise. And I'm doing this globally to the whole image, but don't panic yet because you're going to lose a lot of detail. I'm also now going to deal with the background. So I'm ignoring everything that's happening to the bird, and all I'm looking at is the background. And I want to darken that a little bit. And you can see the whole thing's getting way too dark, but that's okay.
Yeah.
And I'm going to open that, and then I'm going to go right back in, and I'm going to open it again. And the second time I do this, and this is a technique I do probably about 25% of the time, but I wanted to show it because I think it's a good example.
Same here.
Of a technique you can use. Now, the second edit is totally for the bird. So now I'm forgetting the background, and I'm going to start to play around with this bird. And for this one, I'm going to lower the noise reduction and increase the sharpening. And this is how I'm going to sharpen the photo. I'm not going to use any third party, or I'm not going to sharpen it in Photoshop, which I often do. But for this one, I'm going to take the sharpening up, and I'm going to reduce or take the noise reduction down to 0.
It looks like with a portrait that close, it's plenty sharp to begin with, too.
Yep. So now I'm just going to play around. And again, Camera Raw and Lightroom have the exact same slider set up. Both programs are made by the same company. My guess is the engine underneath is probably pretty similar. I'm going to pull up these shadows quite a bit, and I'm actually going to go almost all the way on the shadows. And then I'm going to pull the whites up just to see if I can get them so they don't blow. And you can see at the top of this histogram, when I go too far, it'll indicate where those are blown. And if I hold the Alt key when I'm dealing with sliders, you can see on the image where the whites will go and blow out. So I'm going to push it as far as I can, and then I can deal with these highlights. If they feel too white, I can kind of pull those down to get more detail. As you go up with the white, sometimes you lose detail, so I'll counteract that and sometimes go down with highlights. There's no golden rule that applies 100% of the time, but this one works a little bit with this. You can increase things like clarity. This dehazing will add some contrast and detail and vibrance in this case, or saturation. I'm doing hairline adjustments to those. And that's what I'm going to do. I'm just going to bring that right into Photoshop. Now I've got two different exposures of the same image. I've got one that I'm going to use for the background, and then I've got the bird itself. So the first thing I'm going to do is copy this over. So I'm copying that. I'm selecting the whole image. You can go up here and edit copy, or I'm using a shortcut. And I'm going to paste it right on top. And now I'm going to use a layer mask. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to reveal everything that's underneath this to the lighter exposure. So you can see it's dark now. And then watch as I start to paint this away.
So
with a 20%.
He's painting with white so he can show the foreground color. Or I'm sorry, he's painting with black to hide the foreground.
I'm painting with black, yeah. So I'm using a 50% brush, and look at what starts to happen. I'm revealing what's underneath, and I want all of those iridescent colors to come out from the lighter exposure, but I'm going to keep the background dark so it feels moody. And then I also want to hit this breast and give it light so that it looks like the light's coming from in front, and hitting that and popping that.
Yeah, it's looking great already.
And even if I just left it there, I mean, that took 5 minutes. I'll show you. Well, I don't have a true before and after, but I mean, to me, that makes a difference. Yeah. I'm going to go a little bit further and show you, because I do a lot of dodging and burning, I'm going to show you a quick way to even go a little bit more and add some dodging to it. So I use a curves adjust layer, and this just adds or takes away from the overall image. And I can even paint this on as well. And that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to apply it to the whole thing. I've got a mask over here. I'm going to hide that mask. And I'm going to do the same thing I just did, which is to paint. Now, here's the thing. Some of you are looking at this like, oh my God, this is too complicated. I don't understand it. Using these layer masks is about the second or third thing you should learn in Photoshop. If you're not using layer masks, I've shown a couple people of this privately, and when they get the hang of it, they're like, oh my God, this is the best thing in Photoshop. And it really isn't as complicated as it sounds. So if you aren't following along, don't worry about it. Write it down on a piece of paper, how to use layer masks, and look up a YouTube video. There's about 10,000 of them that will show you the basic technique. So now I'm even adding more on that iridescent part because that's what I want to show. I'm going to add a little bit more to the breast. I could play around with this a bunch, but again, I'm going to try to keep this to a 2 or 3 minute edit. And a lot of times I will also go in and give a lot of detail on these eyes. I'll show you that in another example later. I don't want to take too much time with this one, but I'm going to go back now and show you the whole before and after. Let me just zoom out so you can see it. And this is the after, a lot more dramatic than that original image. For sure. And then that's a fine image. And again, that was edited a little bit in Adobe Raw. But when you do that, it's real dramatic. Here's the cool thing. Because I'm working in layers, if I got to this point and I said, wow, I went too far with this, I can just take the layers and reduce this opacity and any combination of the layers that I want to use. So I'm going to say, man, I went too far. Let me back it down a little bit. I'm going to end up here. And now the before and after is going to look not quite as drastic. Nice. And again, it's just a way these layer masks give you the ability to individually change. And you'll see when I do my later example, some images I might use 15 layers on one image because there's a lot of small things that I'm working on. If I'm doing a print for somebody that orders it, I'll go back from the original raw file and re-edit the entire image because I really do want it to be perfect. And I'll take my time, and I might have 10 or 15 different layers of adjustments. And then I can go back and individually adjust the opacity. So, Ray, that was the first edit. We're only going to do one live edit, guys, so don't worry about sitting through this whole thing. If that was boring, I apologize. We're going to do, and then we're just going to show a lot of before and after. So I'll kick it back to Ray.
Alrighty.
And I think he's got one that he's going to do as well.
Yeah, so I have a photo here from Jetmir. I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce your last name, so I don't want to mess it up. It's this lovely, I think it's a gray heron from where he photographed it. And great light. Background's a little bit sticky here, but let's just get right into the edit. So I'm in Lightroom. First thing I'm going to do is go ahead and crop it. And I like to crop something like that. And let's make some adjustments. So I'm going to kick the exposure up a little bit. I actually really like the white balance. It's really good. It's got that nice warm tone to it from the earlier late light, whichever it is. And the highlight curve here, I'm bringing up the lights a little bit. And I'm going to bring the shadows up a touch and then bring the blacks down to maintain some contrast. The other thing I'm going to do to try and zero in on the bird here is use the gradient adjustment tool here. And I'm just going to drag one straight down from the top. Darken that just a little bit, and I'll do the same on the bottom there. So there, that's my Lightroom edit, looking good from there. So from here, I'm just gonna edit in Photoshop, and it's gonna go ahead and pop it into Photoshop for me. And I use pretty much the exact same techniques that Scott uses. So the first thing I would do is put a quick retouch layer on it, and the couple of things that bug me the most in the background are like these big sticks that just intersect the head there. So again, I'm gonna do this really quick here, but I'm just gonna, clone those out. And this is going to be rough just because I want to try and get through this quick for you guys here. But I'm just going to try and
Ray's doing
clean
this,
that up. Yeah.
Ray, as you're doing this, I just want to mention, so I mentioned there's a couple things that you should learn early on when you're doing Photoshop. The number 1 or 2 thing is cloning.
Yeah.
That's what Ray's doing right now. So if you've never cloned before, he's just sampling from parts of the image and using that to go over a part that, in this case, he's taking away. We would normally do this as branch removal.
Yeah.
So
that was,
I think this would. Go ahead.
I was just going to say that was all using just the clone tool and the spot healing tool, I think. So there we go. That's pretty clean. Because I overlapped, I'm going to add a layer mask to it. And then I can kind of cut back in those areas that I messed up. So that's the advantage of using layers and a layer mask. So you can see I did the cloning on its own layer right over here. And now I'm using a layer mask to kind of cut back in those areas that I overlapped and didn't do a very good job in, which is fine because I knew I was going to be doing this. So it's not perfect, but there we go. Now we don't have to worry about those. Actually, I guess it would make sense to get rid of the rest of this here. So it's not a piece of grass growing into nowhere. So there we go, nice and clean. We got a nice open area for the bird now. So the next thing I would do, a curves adjustment layer. I'm gonna kick up the highlights just a little bit, keep the contrast. I'm gonna paint that in just on the bird. So just like Scott was doing. So it's now using basically a dodge layer to kind of enhance the areas that we want. I'm gonna do another curves adjustment layer to just kind of lighten up that eye, really make that stand out nicely. I'm also going to increase the blue in the background. So a third curves adjustment layer now. And now I'm in the blue channel and the red channel. And I was just adjusting it to make these blue tones back here a little bit nicer. So you can see I'm just painting that in around the bird. Where there was already some blue tones, I'm just going to kind of enhance them. So we get some nice color stuff happening here. And then I'm just going to do another curves adjustment layer that kind of darkens things. So you know what, let me show you there. Here's the curves adjustment layer, and then I'm just going to bring down everything, fill it with black so it's not visible anywhere, and then I'll just paint that in. And that's probably about all I would do. I think this branch is a little distracting, so I'd maybe just kind of lightly go over that, so I don't need to remove it, but just kind of tone it down a little bit. So from total before to after. So pretty quick. Subtle changes, each layer individually. Watch, I'll turn them all off. So that layer does that. Then we do that to the eye. Then we add a little blue. And then we darken some areas to bring your attention to the bird. Turning all those on and off, though, is a bit more of a significant change. And then when we get rid of the distracting branches, we end up with that. So let me just save that real quick, and then I'll show you a quick before and after. It's saving right now. Saving. Computers are never fast enough. All right, back into Lightroom. I'm going to go back to the original RAW file. I'm going to go ahead and reset it so we can see a complete before and after. And there we go. So not a major dramatic change there, but definitely an improvement, I would hope you would say. And, it took me, 5-6 minutes, something like that. All right, so Scott, you ready to get into your images?
Yeah, I'm going to kick it off. I was in Utah last year, and I had never photographed a barn owl. And I was there, and I met a couple people, and the guy's like, "Yeah,
the stream just died."
Yep.
I'm not sure why. I just noticed that. Let me see if it comes back in a second here. Wow, I don't have anything using the internet here, so I'm not sure what would have caused that. All right, it's back. All right, go ahead. You can pick back up.
Yeah, so I was in Utah recently, and last year I was with some friends, and we were looking for a barn owl. They wanted to show me one because I had never seen one. We did come across one, and I was so desperate to get a photo. I was there for 3 minutes. This owl wasn't going to move. I found the best vantage point I could get to get a clear shot. You could see it's a little obstructed. And then I told my sister-in-law about it, and she said, I want that barn owl picture that you took in Utah for my wall. She's got a beautiful home, and I could not send her this picture. I'm not putting this on somebody's wall and putting my name on it. it just doesn't look great. So
Yeah.
what I had done, and I'm not going to go through the full edit, but I do want to show you what you can do when you have to save an image. I tried to make this dramatic, and what I didn't like about this image was it was taken with a lot of hot spots. You can see like a shadow and sun here. It's got some branches on him. Using the techniques Ray did, I did a slight branch removal here. I do want to have you note that when you do branch removal, you're generally disqualified from competition entry. So you can't consider these true photographs as they were shot. So, but if you're hanging it, listen, if somebody wants to buy a picture and I got to remove a branch, I'm going to sell a picture.
Yeah.
So I took these branches out. I dodged and burned, but mostly burned significantly these areas that I didn't like and weren't attractive. And it ended up here. A much, much, much different image, one that she really liked. She had it framed and put on her wall. You could see I warmed it quite a bit to give it the feel that it was, at sunrise rather than 3 or 4 hours after sunrise. And then I just darkened and burned out everything that was distracting. So there's a layer up there. I should get rid of that that I had done. But yeah, you could see, again, I'll toggle this on and off, but you could just see what a dramatic difference from one image to the other. One is
nice change.
Again, it's not perfect, and it was tough to deal with, but it's a picture that I really felt like I had to save, and the final result is pretty good, and it does look really nice on her wall. So I'm gonna kick that one back to you, Ray.
All right, here we go. So, real simple, basic thing here. So, a snowy egret. It was backlit at dawn. So here's a scenario where, and this happens all the time to me, especially shooting in these conditions, where the camera picked the totally wrong white balance. So because I'm shooting in RAW, I just let the camera do auto white balance because it's one less thing for me to worry about while I'm shooting. I already have enough going on. And I know I can just as easily change the white balance after the fact, as it's easier to actually change after the fact than it is while shooting for me. So here's the Lightroom edit. So it's a crop, a white balance adjustment, and just some color and contrast. So you can already see from this cool tone, it actually brought it more to, and this is what it looked like to my eye. It was early morning sun, really rich oranges, all the tones were warm. And then from there I went into Photoshop, and that's the Photoshop edit. So you can really see I got rid of that little falling feather on the left. I love to have falling feathers, but this doesn't look like a feather. It's just like a messy kind of feather. It doesn't even look like a feather, so it was a distraction to me. So I got rid of it. And then the other big thing is just a little bit lighter on the bird, and I really popped the eye there. So pretty much a simple change there, so not a big difference from the beginning to the end, but you can fix it pretty quickly. So back to you, Scott.
All right, and I'm going to do a similar example. I pulled this one up since Ray was talking about shooting backlit. We were out shooting loons in New Hampshire recently, and man, I was following this loon, and I saw this image setting up, and it was gorgeous. But like Ray said, we were shooting auto white balance, but I was also shooting auto ISO, so the camera was controlling the exposure. And in this situation, the fog and the loon being dark, the fog being light, the camera couldn't figure it out, and it got it all wrong. So when I looked, I expected to look at the back of my camera and see what I was seeing with my eyes, which was this gorgeous scene of this fog. And then I looked at this and I thought, wow, that's not what I saw. And what
not even close.
No, Ray was there. He could tell you. It
yeah.
didn't look like this.
Oh, it was glowing.
I'm taking a curves adjust layer. I'll show you 3 different ways to do this right off the bat, and this is in Photoshop, but it's basically just exposure. Watch what happens when I get the exposure close. You'll see the detail in the fog coming out. You see the bird start to get silhouetted.
Yeah.
So there's a before and after. That's just dropping the exposure with the curves adjust layer, and what a difference that made.
Yeah.
You could do it a bunch of ways. Here's brightness. If you took brightness down and pulled contrast up, I bet you get something similar. Yeah, you end up getting something similar. You could go to the exposure one. Here's exposure. You could drop the exposure, and then you'd have to probably play around with this gamma, gamma and offset and all this. And
well, it's just fun to say
play
gamma.
Around, but yeah, I do like to say gamma. But what I did is I took it into to Photoshop Adobe Raw, or Adobe Photoshop Raw. I dropped the exposure, and then I warmed it back up so that it felt like the original. And let me show you what it came out to look like, which was much closer to what we had.
Yeah, man.
So this is a white balance push to warm with an exposure that allowed all of these details in the fog to show. When I warmed the whole image globally, what I didn't like is that the water got warm.
Yep.
And I used a gradient to counteract it. So I basically warmed the entire image, and then I used a gradient bottom to top to go cooler and let the water come back to its more blue color. So we had the gold that was there, the backlit fog from the early sun. This was right at dawn. So this is all legit. And then I wanted to make this water kind of retain some of the blue. So let me just go before and after on this one. Before, not very pretty. After, that one looks pretty good.
Awesome change, Scott.
All right.
All right, we got a great question. Miguel Acosta asks, when you are happy with all the layers and finished with all edits, what is the best preferred practice? Do you flatten the image, merge down, or merge visible? So for me, I just save all those layers. I don't merge any of them. I just hit save. It goes back into Lightroom for me with all the layers intact. And that way, oh, I'm so sorry, excuse me. And that way, at any point in the future, I can open that Photoshop image up again and make just some tweaks on the existing edits that I've done. So the advantage of having those layers is that you can always change them anytime in the future. And for me, I always save them in layers. And once it's back into Lightroom, that's when I'll do some exporting. So I'll export it as a JPEG to post on Facebook, or I use some plugins directly in Lightroom that will automatically convert it and publish it to a lot of the social media that I use. I think you save your layers as well, correct, Scott?
Yeah, I save all the layers, and then I do 3 versions. I do a JPEG, and then I do a resized JPEG for Facebook and all social media, just so it doesn't take up the room and get compressed.
Perfect, but great question.
Yeah, and if you're posting to social media, sometimes the rules change. I think most people are posting for best results. Facebook will compress a big file. So if you go 1,500 to 2,000 on the long end, I think that's most current, but I could be wrong.
I used to do that, and now I'm posting pretty much full size on there. I've found better results with that recently. So who the hell knows?
I think they made a change, and they're allowing more data on their pictures than they used to.
All right. So here we have a Marsh Wren. So this is a scenario where it was a little bit of the camera picking the wrong white balance and me wanting to take artistic license with this photo. So here's the original photo. Here's the Lightroom adjustment. So I really cranked the contrast and warmed up, especially that top half. And then in Photoshop, I just really enhanced that color and made it really stand out and cleaned up a little bit of these kind of dark, shady areas in there. So from before and after on this, really significant change. But this was probably a 3-minute edit total, so not a lot of time. All right, back to you, Scott.
All right, I'm going to do a Marsh Wren too. Since you pulled up a Marsh Wren, I'm going to do a portrait. So the one I have up on my screen, I was leaving an area that I think Ray and I had shot together. He took off, and I hadn't photographed Marsh Wrens in a while, and they were everywhere. You could hear them. I found this guy right on the side of the road, and I thought, let me see what I can do. The light wasn't good, and you can see the light, and we would call this like flat light, where it's directional in that it's shining in the direction of the bird, so you don't get a lot of shadows straight down, but it's just not flattering. So what I wanted to do, I loved the pose, and right behind the bird, you can see these grasses are like split into a V, and so everything, like compositionally, I loved it. I just didn't like the colors. What I did is I warmed it quite a bit. I brought out some dodging and burning to bring out some details. And then this is the after I pushed it really far, and you could see it's much more vibrant. It feels more like a golden hour photo. Basically, I cheated a lot, and I took a photo that was 3 hours after sunrise. If this is pushed too far, and I'm showing you the pushed far version, remember, when you're working in layers or more than one, you have the ability to come back and change opacity. So if I looked at this and said, man, I just went too far with that thing. I got carried away. Let me come in here, and I can pull this down wherever I want, and maybe that's a better balance for me and doesn't feel quite as drastic. So kind of a way that you can cheat. You warm the image a little bit, use some dodging and burning to draw attention to the areas you want, and it gives a little bit of shape to the light. So before, kind of flat, not beautiful. After is one that I liked a little bit better. All right, back to you, Ray.
All right. So I want to just mention, going back to Miguel's question and something Scott just mentioned, another reason to save in layers is, and this happens to me semi-often, I'll edit a photo, I think it looks great, and then I'll save it, and I'll walk away and maybe come back an hour later, 2 hours later, the next morning, and I look at it, and I'm like, wow, I really went too far with that. And having all those layers still intact, I can just easily, just like Scott showed you, dial that right back in. So I think it's always worth saving in layers. All right, so here's a snowy egret. This was something I would normally never shoot. I was actually just kind of scouting this day. It was high noon, right smack in the middle of the day, in the middle of summer. You can see the sun is directly overhead, so far from ideal lighting, but the scene looked really nice to me, and I saw that there was a lot of light reflecting off the water and the sand. It was really shallow, light sand underneath the water there. So I took the shot. Here's the Lightroom edit. So I really pulled up the shadows to kind of soften them up, and I increased the blue so you could really see that. And then here's the final Photoshop edit. So really popping that blue, really making the eyes stand out and lightening those shadows even more. So and looking at it now from where I went, it's probably a little bit too far with the blue actually. So this is one of those scenarios where if I had come back, a day or so later, I may have actually adjusted it differently. But in any case, you can see the before and after here, pretty significant. And, again, it wasn't too crazy amount of time on the edit. So, all right, you're up, Scott.
Yeah, I'm going to go with a skimmer. And on this one, I actually have the layers preserved. This is one I actually shot last week. So I was editing it early this week. And when we were talking about this theme of editing, I thought, let me use this as an example. And I'm actually going to show the layers here. What I liked about this is it was kind of the picture I was looking for. I wanted a backlit image where I had water skimming with light showing through it. I got some silhouettes. This isn't really a silhouette. It's just a little backlit, and the light was real low. So the first thing I did is I brought it in from Lightroom, and it looks like this. So I added a lot of, I increased the exposure, added contrast to it, tried to make it pop a little bit, and warmed it up just a hair. The next thing I did, and these two layers aren't really a whole lot other than sharpening. You probably can't even tell the difference, but a little noise reduction and a little sharpening. A couple of adjustments to color. But here's what I wanted to show you, and this is one of those finishing touches for me. When I put on this last layer, this is, I have it labeled here, eye dodge, but it's basically a layer that I just dodged key parts of this bird. So when I looked at this, there's a little bit of catch light on this eye, but it's not real strong. It's just around the top. And there's also these little highlights up here on the top of the bird and up on the wings. And I wanted to get that to draw the attention to the eyes. And then I wanted to highlight around the bill and the water. So this last one is just going to increase and pop those areas. It's subtle, but to me, it makes a big difference to the finished product. So again, I'll go before and after. And then I'm going to show you the flat raw file and the before and after this way. So again, now here's the more dramatic change. Before and after.
Nice, man.
Yeah, and this is an image I really like this image, and part of it is because it's what I was trying to get. I was set up in the water with the bird, and I really felt like this was one of those that I wanted, and I wanted to make sure I took the time to get the edit to feel the way it felt when I was out in the field. And when you look at these flat raw files, that's just not doing anything for you. That's not what it looked like.
Yeah.
So, yep.
Nice,
there you
man.
go.
All right, cool.
Back to you.
All right, so Hooded Merganser, another one of these slightly off white balance. The camera picked the wrong one, and I wanted to get a little bit more artistic with it as well. So here I pushed the white balance just a little bit more warm than my eye did see that day, but not far. So what my eye saw that day was probably somewhere in between that and that. And then in Photoshop, just a real quick tweak here, just kind of burning and removing some of the color on that, and then same thing, popping highlights, like Scott just said, to really kind of draw your eye in there. So, and that's, I think, the key to a good edit, unless you're trying to do something really dramatic with it. Just a good standard basic edit is a lot of little small adjustments that add up to a really nice significant change, and that change doesn't have to be far or drastic, but just a lot of these little, light in here, dark in there, just kind of clean things up, make it look nice. And I think they can those small changes can add up to a really nice final polished image. You're up, Scott.
Yeah. Well, and speaking of a nice polished image, because Ray's humble and won't tell you guys this was selected for one of Audubon's top 100 this year. This is, be careful how I word this. This is an image that deserved to be in the top 100, and it's a beautiful image. He had two images, actually. This wasn't my favorite of his two. His other one is honestly one of the best pictures I've ever seen, and a really, really great entry. So Ray had 2 top 100s, and that was one of them.
Thanks. And real quick,
This
just to mention on that, on the contest edit, so I did a separate contest edit that didn't have the removal of that one little tiny object because that's not allowed in the contest. So that Photoshop file I just showed you, the final edit was what I shared originally, but when I entered the contest, I did a separate edit that didn't include those things.
All right. This is an image that was not in the top 100, nor should it have been. But I don't shoot this was shot a couple years ago. I hadn't been shooting a lot of backlit photos. Ray does a lot more of it than I do, but I still like to include a little bit. And what I caught my eye is this guy was just a couple days old, and he's so fuzzy. I really wanted to get something backlit. Now the sun had already come up by the time I could get him in this position close enough to get the detail. So again, we pushed the warmth a lot in this just to get something that looked a little bit better. So you could see it's damn near nuclear on this one.
Yeah.
So if you need to go, again, working in layers and pull that down, you can always go back in these layers and adjust. So what I ended up with was closer to this rather than the first version, which came out of the my first edit was here. Sometimes when you're doing these edits casually and slowly, you start building and building and building. And you don't realize how far you've gone because it's a gradual adjustment.
Yeah.
It's kind of like having your eyes slowly adjust to daylight rather than just wake up to bright daylight. Mm-hmm. And then you come back to it and you're like, whoa, I went a little too far. And so again, these layers give you the ability to adjust. So I'll go before and after on this one. But you see the before was a little flat. It just didn't have the warmth that I was looking for. And then just adding a little bit of warmth kind of pushed that. And that's really all I did to this image was just play around with the white balance.
Yeah, that same thing happens to me all the time. So here's an American oyster catcher. I shot through some marsh grass, so it was a little faded. That's why it's kind of weak. So in Lightroom, increase some contrast. And then in Photoshop, clean that up a little bit more. So more increased contrast. And then a subtle edit that I did here that you'll notice is, see when the contrast was increased, a lot of green showing up on the neck there, which is because I was shooting through some green, so it's all out of focus in the foreground. So in Photoshop, I cleaned that up. I kind of desaturated that green and brought the color back more towards where it should be. So, just simple little things like that can add up to make a nice, clean, finished image. You're up, Scott.
All right, the next one I have up is a seaside sparrow. This was under weird lighting, so I'm actually in my Jeep, and I was shooting the sparrows in the grasses, and this guy hopped down. And what happened when he did that is he landed in the shadow. So now there's no light on him, and you can see these bright sticks up at the top. When I got it home, I hadn't photographed seaside sparrow in a while, and this was almost uncropped. That's how close he was. He was really close. I was with my close lens setup, 300 2.8 with a teleconverter, and that's how close he was. So I thought, you know what, let me play around and see if I can save this image. So the first thing I did is, again, I went back to the white balance because it's all screwed up, and I just warmed the whole thing, did some dodging and burning. And I'm just going to show you a couple layers that I threw on here. At the bottom, these bright things, as a general rule when editing, this is my personal preference, I will darken below the bird, especially if those areas are light, and draw my eye down away from the bird's eyes. And then in general, if the top is darker, I'll do the inverse and I'll lighten it. So if you look at just the light down here, these colors are much lighter. And then actually up here, it's darker. So the first layer is a burn layer, just to get rid of some of that. The second layer is a dodge layer. You can already start to see a difference as I'm building on. You can see here, this is an eye layer. I'm going to go in closer. And this is just adding some to the eye. And then the next layer is a second one with saturation. So I just added a little bit of saturation. When you dodge an area or lighten an area, sometimes it'll wash it out. And when you burn an area, sometimes it will increase the saturation, or the saturation will appear increased. So I do play around with saturation sometimes. Let me go back now. As I did that step by step, I don't know if you can appreciate how many changes were made. But when I go back to the original, look at the difference between that. Out of the camera, again, the white balance isn't right because the camera is not judging it correctly. So I decided just to go ahead and push it and go really warm with the whole thing. Lighten the eye, darken below, lighten above a little bit. And that's this would be like my signature type edit for any portrait with that dodging and burning technique.
Yeah, it looks great. Nice job. All right, we have a great question in the comments. It's do you guys make any selections with your edits or just brush in where you want adjustments? And I'm going to answer it for myself here with this photo that I'm going to show you of the short-eared owl. I would say I use actual selection tools maybe, I don't know, 10% of all of my edits. Other than that, I'm usually just using manual brushing techniques to basically make selections, and I'll show you what I mean by this. So here's an image that I love to shoot. I love shooting backlight, but backlight a lot of the times, especially when you have lens flare, which there's a little bit kicking in on the right here, it needs a lot of editing. So you can see the image is washed out. I do have the good backlit rim light here on the shorty, but you know, it's not really standing out. The colors are just weak, and to my eye that day, everything was like on fire, glowing. So Lightroom edit, here we go. So now you can see much richer, much more contrast, but the owl is really dark and not really standing out of this background. So here's what I really want. I want that owl to stand out and the background to be a little bit darker. So that's what I did in Photoshop. And let me just pop into Photoshop and show you what I do with these selections here. So let me take it back from scratch here. So this is one of those where I did a second edit. So here's the entire lighter version. So darker version, lighter version, and then I cut out just the owl. So here's the selection for that owl, but I manually did that. I just used a brush and went in and made that selection. So I have a selection, but I didn't really use a selection tool per se. And then let's see, a dodge layer kind of finishes the rim light. It kind of enhances. It was a little bit lost on the top of the head there, so I fixed that. Then the eye is going to get lightened just a touch. So let me actually zoom in for you guys here just a little bit so you can really see and appreciate that. So here's the fix on that top. There's the eye gets popped. Then I'm going to darken everything but the bird. Add some contrast to overall. Add a little bit of a color shift overall. And then we're all set. So there's the entire before and after from Lightroom to Photoshop. So pretty, a wildly significant change from the beginning image here. And it may be too far for some people, and I can completely appreciate that. But for me, that's kind of how I wanted to go with that photo. All right, Scott.
Yeah, and I'll answer that about selections. I can't remember the last time I tried. I get so frustrated with selections that I generally just give up. And one of the things that plays to my advantage is I use a very shallow depth of field. I get that not a lot of people like the way I shoot portraits, but I'm shooting it so that the eyes and basically just the eye and part of the head is sharp. You'll see on this one, the end of this bill is out of focus, yeah, and the back of the bird is out of focus. So for me, there's no point, let's say for sharpening, for example, to make a selection of this bird makes no sense. All I'm going to do is apply sharpening, and then I'm going to paint it in these areas. I'm just going to paint around here and around here. Same thing if I was to dodge or burn, I would just paint in the areas that I wanted to dodge or burn. And this eye is a good example of that. Let me see if I messed it up. If I was to pull just this eye dodge, you could see that just that little bit of pop there. That's just painted in with a paintbrush. So I just take my brush with the mask and I just paint in around the eye normally. But yeah, I almost never use selections. I know some people do and they're very good at it. To me, I can't do it. I get too frustrated.
Yeah. Scott, we got about 15 minutes before we hit an hour. You want to do like one more image each and then we'll do our edit off?
Yep, because I wanted to show one image that's garbage, yeah, but that I wanted to try to save. So up on my screen now is an eagle, and when we were down at Conowingo, and mostly we just go there to bullshit
laugh
around a little
fun.
bit. Yeah, have fun.
Every once in a while, you take a photo
of each other. Yeah, sometimes we get photos. So we were shooting this scene, and I'm like, oh my god, that's so cool. That the two birds were like they locked talons, but right before they locked, they got together. And then I got home and I looked at it, and I'm like, that's awful. There wasn't really anything good. Like it was just half backlit. It's not a silhouette. It's like so I call these in between. It's like an in between shot. It doesn't want to be a silhouette, and it's not really front lit, so you don't get any detail. But I liked the pose, so I thought, you know what? I had edited a bunch from that day. I said, let me go back to this one and see if I can make something of it. So what I did is I just went complete silhouette. And when you shoot back into the sun like this, it's just going to blow out the background completely. So this is not what it looked like. I can promise you it didn't look like it this day, but here's the way I went with it. I went complete silhouette. So I just took out all of the highlights, shadows. I've just dropped everything down. And then I just warmed the whites until they got a golden tone. And again, you could play around with opacity, but the problem with this image is if you start to adjust the opacity on this, it's going to stop becoming a silhouette.
Yeah,
so if you want to just
between again.
Yeah, it becomes an in-between image again. So I felt like you had to kind of commit to the silhouette and just go for it. And I kind of like the way it came out. It's not a great quality image, but it was a neat scene. A lot of people think this is a reflection of one bird and another bird on water. I had some people say, oh, what a cool reflection. But it is, you could see from the original, it's just two birds. So that's the last one. I just wanted to show one image that was just really pushed, where there was something there. And a lot of people might have just said, forget that. I can't do anything with it. But it's a direction you can go sometimes.
Yeah, and I want to point out, there has to be something there to begin with, right? So what's here in this one is the action, the interaction between those two birds. That's not something you get to see or photograph very often. So having that there gives you the motivation to maybe think a little bit farther about how you can push it and where you can go with it. Whereas if it was just, let's say it was just that top bird flying along, facing away with the wings in a weird position, like there'd be no reason to try and do an edit like this. Would you agree? Yeah.
100%.
All right, cool. All right, so here's my last one. So a wood duck. It's a tame wood duck photographed at a place that we usually visit every year. I specifically went to photograph them backlit. So here's one of the things that's awesome about these newer cameras. I shoot with a Nikon D4S, and it has incredible dynamic range on it. So I should have shot this at ISO 200 to really get more out of it, but it was at 400, so relatively low ISO, especially for that camera. And you can see right here, it is, I don't even know what it is. You know, the white balance is completely off. There's these strong, crazy highlights. You can see almost no detail on the bird. It's not a great angle for a silhouette, so what do you do with a photo like this? Well, here's the Lightroom edit. So I pulled the highlights way down to get some detail in that sparkle on the river there, and then I brought the shadows way up to get some detail in the wood duck there. But the problem is it's kind of not far enough. So this is one of those where I double processed it, and I'll show you the layers. But here's the final edit in Photoshop. So as you can see, from the beginning on that one to where I ended up is just, you know, wildly different. So this was definitely a significant edit, kind of similar to what Scott was just showing you. And let me just pop this up open in Photoshop and show you what I did with the layers. Okay, so we start out with that layer like I had in Lightroom. Then I processed another version like this, a little bit lighter, a little bit more detail, and that got painted in on the duck. Then I processed a darker version that gave me more detail in those highlights that are kind of blown in the background, and those got painted in to bring out those, to get rid of the really bright hot spots. Then I burned down those really hot spots, but you can see what happens when there's actually no detail to recover there. It goes gray. But then I put a color layer, so it's a layer, just a blank layer, pixel layer, and I changed the blending mode of it to color, and then I paint on it like that with a sampled color of stuff nearby, and then it actually adds tone to those areas. Then I kind of cloned over top of it with some of the texture from the other areas to make it look like it was actually there. So before that cloning, it's just kind of these flat chunks of color with no detail, and then after I did a little bit of cloning, it looks a little bit more natural like it was there. So the next thing is we're going to add some contrast to the duck now, so that's that layer. Then we're going to burn some other areas that were a little distracting to me. Then we're going to really increase the blacks in some areas. Another curve to kind of punch up those, the highlight and the color on the head and the breast of the duck. A dodge layer on the breast of the duck there. Now this is where I start enhancing colors. So I added a little bit more blue to the top there, a little bit more cyan to the colors. Here's those magenta pink tones on the cheek. Then some reds in the breast and the eye, then the yellow on the bill, and then the green on the head. So that's all the layers right there. You can see this is definitely a significant edit. But from there to there in Photoshop, and just real quick one more time from beginning to end, that was out of camera. And that was where I ended up with. So this isn't something I would normally do. I normally, the majority of my photos, I never push that far, but there was something there that I wanted with this one. I really like that head-on pose, and I thought the final product kind of came out interesting. You ready for the edit off, Scott? Hey, Scott, you there? Uh-oh, did I lose Scott?
No, I'm here.
There he is.
My dog just came in the room. So I was a little afraid I was a little afraid you guys were going to hear a little Miss Tilly.
Gotcha.
But you make a good point, Ray. Sometimes I'll play around with a file just to play around with it, just to see what you can do.
Yeah.
And it's kind of educational. You're teaching yourself as you're experimenting. So definitely experiment with some of this stuff for those who are just getting into it. And there's a lot that you can do. And again, it doesn't have to be significant. It doesn't have to be heavy. We did some edits tonight that were just 30 seconds, 40 seconds, but made a big difference to the image.
Yep.
And then you can see like Ray's last image, that takes a little bit of work and a little bit of experience. And that's not a beginner's edit, but it makes a huge difference. So I'm ready to pull up. Mark, if you're on the timer, we're going to pull up an image that was submitted to us.
From Karen Smith.
We have not edited this, so we're both approaching this for the first time.
Yep.
I've looked at it, so I kind of know in my head where I want to go with this, I think. But it's going to be interesting. So, Mark, if you're in the chat, if you can just let us know.
I have a timer right here if you want.
Oh, do you? Okay.
Yeah, I got one on my phone here, so I'll just start up our 5-minute timer. And
okay.
I guess, do you have the image open in your raw editor to get started there? Looks like you do.
Yep.
Yeah, and I am there too.
Yep.
All right, you ready to rock?
All right, let's go.
Let's do it.
All right, so I'm going to just crop real quick. I could tell you there's a lot of hot spots in this one that we're going to both have to figure out how to deal with. And if you guys look at the histogram up top, you could see it's pushed a lot. So, yeah, I know what I'm going to do with this already.
All right, so yeah, I started with a crop, and then I did some a little bit of exposure adjustment, kicked the shadows up, and then I did a radial gradient adjustment in in Lightroom to kind of really draw your eye in onto the bird. So I think I'm about done with my Lightroom edit. I'm gonna go ahead and hop into Photoshop at this point.
Oh my gosh, this is like I literally when we do this is the second time we've done it. I literally sweat.
That's hilarious.
I don't know why. I don't know why I get nervous when I'm on a timer, but it just seems like you're under pressure.
Under the gun.
So I'm doing. I did two exposures again on this one.
Oh.
And
Scott's going all out.
I can do it pretty quickly, and I'm just gonna have to paint the exposure back on these guys. I hope I can get this done right without making it look hokey. But I know I want highlights on this branch. Now, the one person who said about selecting, when you're painting like I am now, you can get off the subject pretty quickly. So to do this quick is not going to be easy. I'm going to have to leave some areas that around the edges just to make sure you don't want to bleed over and cause halos. That looks awful.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to try not to do that.
Yeah, that's one thing we didn't really talk about tonight. Be careful with your edits. I think most of the time, unless you're really going for that artistic effect, you don't want it to look edited. That's part of the kind of the process there, So if you do something that, leaves a halo or any kind of obvious editing, telltale sign, it's something you really want to try and prevent.
I don't know if you could see what I'm doing over here. I think you could see mine.
Yeah, I have both of the screens up. We're split screening right now. I'm just about done, actually. I don't know what else I would do with this. I'm going to keep it pretty simple. I mean, since let's see where we're at here. We got 2 minutes and 30 seconds left. Since I have some time, I might hop into the original RAW back in Lightroom and get a little bit more detail in my background there.
Uh-huh. You're stealing my idea. I see how you are.
Well, I got extra time since I'm already done my edit, so. So if you guys are noticing the speed with it that I edit, I worked in Photoshop as just a digital retoucher for about 10 years, 40 hours a week. That's all I did. I didn't really do shooting for some studios. I just did all of their editing work. and one of them was a wedding and portrait studio. The other was an architect photographer. So I got really, really good and efficient at Photoshop. So most of the time, you're probably not going to see people editing quite this quick. And it's just simply because I put so much time into it. But yeah, there, I think I'm pretty happy with that edit. So I'm going to go ahead and save that. So I'll note my time was with basically
There are
3
no
minutes,
bonus
30
points
seconds.
for finishing. No bonus points for finishing first. Trying to hit some of the color on the main bird, and I can't get enough on this head, so I want to get some more on here. I may have to do another. So these are curves adjust layers, and again,
I'll
I'm
let you
just
guys watch
creating a
Scott's
curve.
screen.
I'm creating a curve adjust layer, and then I'm just painting in the areas that I want. So I want to make sure that these greens start to stand out. So I'm just brightening selectively some of that stuff. And then I'm trying to get rid of some of those shadows. So you can see the biggest thing I did was try to get rid of that stuff at the bottom. I cloned using 2 clones at different angles. So I took this, and instead of resampling it across, I flipped it and inverted it, and I painted it over the bottom to make it look like there were pine cones going up from
30
underneath.
seconds left.
Yeah, I got to do something with this top, though. Hold on.
You definitely went a little bit of a different direction than me. That's cool.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm trying to just really burn down. This is like when something's real bright. I know a couple guys that do this really well. This a 5-minute edit is probably not going to be considered really done really well, but where they'll just burn down a lot and try to leave the subject in focus. So now I'm just trying to burn down a couple of these hot spots. I'm just actually using a paintbrush and painting right over it.
That's it. Time.
All right, that's what I got.
All right, let's see
All
what
right, so
you
you
got
want to
there.
do a split? You want to do a split screen?
I got the split screen there. Can you view yours just a little bit larger?
Yep.
There we go. So yeah, you definitely went
All
with
right.
a darker edit than me. I did the similar technique of you, by kind of darkening the exterior areas, but I didn't go quite as far as you. And I will say, I think I would actually vote for yours in this instance. So let us know in the comments, which one do you guys like? A couple of comments while you guys are leaving some comments. I noticed Richard says between the Black Skimmer edit and the Wood Duck edit, his mind is totally blown on how an image can be rescued. That's great to hear. That's kind of one of the things we wanted to show you guys, is how some of these images can be rescued from what maybe looks not so great out of the camera. And then someone asked if we use a tablet. Actually, they said, does Scott use a tablet, a Wacom tablet? Scott, are you still using your tablet? I know you had one at one point.
All right. So I have one, and I used to use it. I think my dog ate the stylus. So for the last 6 months, I have not used it. But for the detail stuff, I will tell you it's very, very helpful in small areas.
And I'll
so
tell
you guys, if you were listening to me edit, you could probably hear my mouse clicking all the time.
feverishly clicking away.
Yeah, it is a pain in the ass. The tablet's nicer, and it has pressure sensitivity.
Yes, that's
so
key.
when you get good at editing, it does make a difference because you can control the pressure of a line or a color just by how hard you press down. You can't do that with a mouse. A mouse is either on or off.
Correct. So even when you lower the opacity on a mouse, there's no way to adjust the opacity throughout the entire brush stroke that you're making. And you can do that with a tablet. So you can actually, in one brush stroke, start at, say, 100% and then kind of softly fade it out. And that subtlety makes a huge difference in your editing, both number one, making it look natural, and number two, with speed. So that is a huge part of the reason I'm really fast with these edits, is that is exactly what I do. I use the tablet, and I've used it for years, so it allows me to be really quick. So I definitely love doing that. So Mark said he'll loan you his stylus. That's great. Karen likes the images. That's great. Cool. So any last minute questions, if you guys want to throw them out there, that'd be great while we're wrapping things up here. Scott, do you have anything you want to mention before I give a wrap up?
No, and I hope we showed a spectrum of some really minor edits that you can see, wow, that makes a difference. And then we showed some of the really aggressive ones. Don't think that every image, I'd hate to have people look at Ray's pictures and say, oh my gosh, it's only because he knows how to edit. There's a 90% has to be right in the camera. There are some exceptions where you can take a picture that's not great and save it if you're really talented in Photoshop or have some basic understanding of how it all works. But I would say for those learning, try to figure out, and again, there's so many tutorials out there that for me and Ray to put out a tutorial that's been done 100 times probably doesn't make sense. But there's several tutorials out there. Figure out cloning in that hummingbird image. I cloned that all in from the existing image very quickly. That's a powerful tool to get rid of distractions. And the other one I would say is figure out very quickly how to make layers and how to use layer adjustments, it would be called, or adjustment layers. So
yep,
layer masks. Yep. So those would be two huge things. And then again, there's what you can do in Lightroom, which is changing things like white balance and whites and blacks and shadows and highlights and hues. And there's a lot you can edit just in Lightroom without getting into Photoshop and actually altering things that are in the photo. So yeah, that's probably where I would leave it.
All right, cool. Yeah, we got some great comments. Thanks for all the really nice comments. Glad you guys enjoyed and learned something. Miguel said he learned a lot. That's great. Sentinel asks if we processed any low light shots. I don't think we did any specific low light shots, but there really wouldn't be any difference. Here's one I didn't show. This was definitely a low light one. There's the Lightroom edit. There's the Photoshop edit. But there's really no difference with a low light image other than maybe occasionally adding in some noise reduction. Other than that, I don't really do anything differently. I do the same kind of thing with a low light image as I do with all these. And yeah, what I want to just add is pretty much a little bit more repeat of what Scott said. Learn all these different techniques so you can kind of use them to your favor when a certain image calls for it. We definitely don't edit every photo to the extreme level that we showed you some of these tonight. A lot more of them are simple. And, if you really get good at these editing techniques, what starts to happen, and this happens to me occasionally, especially when I'm shooting my backlight stuff, is that I actually start to shoot with a final edit in mind. So I'll maybe purposefully underexpose or overexpose an image, knowing which direction I'm going to actually push it in the computer when I get it there to kind of end up at the result I want. So, being confident in your edits and knowing where you can go can actually kind of even start to change the way you shoot. And that can be a really powerful thing to kind of have the vision from capture all the way through to output. So I think those things can be helpful.
Yep, and if you are going to start editing more and more, make sure you're shooting raw files. You'll be able to push them a lot further than you can with JPEGs.
Oh, yeah.
They take up more storage, and you'll have to have certain viewers to deal with them. But yeah, I would definitely encourage you, if you've gotten through the basics of your camera, you know how to shoot it, and you're starting to get more serious, you're going to have to start shooting raw at some point. It'll give you a lot more flex. We couldn't do some of these edits. We could not have done if we had shot it in the camera as JPEG. There's just no way.
Yeah, definitely not. Scott, do you have any specific mouse you use? Let's see. Somebody asks if there was a recommendation on the mouse that you use for retouching versus a tablet. I don't really think there's anything special. I have a Logitech mouse that has all kinds of buttons customized on it, but I only use that for actually Lightroom edits. I don't use it in Photoshop at all. But yeah, I think just any generic mouse would actually kind of work just fine. What's up?
And Mark knows me too well to know that I would go out and spend a lot of money on a fancy mouse. So whatever got good reviews on Amazon and was wireless, yeah, that's probably where I went. I don't spend a ton of money outside of my lenses, which is probably the biggest investment I make in wildlife photography because it makes the most impact. For those of you, I saw somebody say about Lightroom and Photoshop, there's a package you can do. It's a monthly subscription that includes both of those. So it's called Photoshop or I think it's called Photographers CC or something similar. But it's a suite just designed at photographers. So you get Lightroom and Photoshop. It is one of those monthly things. So they're going to tag you for the rest of your life. But you don't have to pay the $400 or $500 or $600 up front for the software.
Yeah,
you just kind of rent it forever.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. All right. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for sticking with us. We had a great audience tonight. It was great doing this on YouTube. I think that worked out well. So I think we're definitely going to stick with YouTube from now on. Run. Yeah. So thank you so much. In a month, we're going to be back with, I don't know, do we have a topic picked out?